basically, Bruce is the more historical guy here. So we could start the narrative with him about what Alfred was up to, and maybe a little bit about what the various symmetrical and Uranian system really is comprised of. You want to take that, Bruce?
Yeah, I just want to make a very general statement at first about Uranian's symmetrical astrology. If you look at astrology as a whole, and in particular as a body of techniques that came out of the classical world, there are 5 primary components, and I think most of them are employed in the practices that almost everybody knows about. But I just want to run over them. First of all, there's the Zodiac. And for a lot of people, that's in the entirety of astrology. But the Zodiac, as I see it, is basically photo period mapped out. That is the altering ratio of daylight to night, sunlight to night over the course of the year. So I think it has like a biological basis. And then you have the houses, which is the diurnal cycle, the risings and settings of planets during the course of the day. And those are compartmentalized into what are called houses or domiciles. And then the third part would be planetary positions, and each planet having its own symbolism. And then you have the aspects between the planets, which are based on the division of the circle by numbers, by lower numbers usually. But there's a fifth part of the basic astrology toolkit, and I would say that that's symmetry. And it's found in ancient techniques in 2 primary areas, the anticia and the parts or lots. And it's this part of astrology that it probably doesn't get as much use as the other 4 with most people. But it's that area, the area of the lots and anticia, that the founder of Uranian symmetrical astrology began to build an entirely unique system of astrology. You got to understand that, let's call it symmetrical astrology because that's what it really is. And in Germany, it's known as the Hamburg School, and in the United States, it was named Uranian astrology, or as Gary told me the other day, the Uranian system of astrology, which is short for USA, or long for USA. But well, I hadn't heard that before, but I thought that was interesting. The thing about it is it's as unique as and as individualized as something like Vedic astrology. It's its own thing. Yeah, it has overlaps with the rest of Western astrology because it was based on it, but the founder, Alfred Witte, whose chart is shown here, and as you can see, has many planets in Aquarius, which are opposite Uranus, took it in his own direction, in a completely unique direction, and it's a solid system. You can do everything that you want with the system as he put it together, and it has a number of other components besides symmetry, including hypothetical planets. But Witte, his dates are 1878 to 1941. And he was a surveyor, and I believe he actually surveyed some airports. Is that true, Gary?
Yes, he laid out. I'm going to put us onto the 360-degree dial now. All of you folks have already now seen what we call the pizza pie chart. So you can now process Witte's horoscope in the way you would look at astrology normally. But this is the way us symmetrical guys kind of first encounter a horoscope. See, when we're looking at the pizza pie chart here, this is a day chart. This is a chart that's based on the day. Planets, this is circulating. The primary is the horizon, right? And the planets are all going around.
It shows the diurnal cycle, basically.
Yeah. And Witte introduces the year chart, as I call it, or the dial. And this is a very useful device because not only do the outer planets stand still while the inner planets are all moving around, which allows your eye to train on things that are of an era, but it also can be used as a measuring device for aspects, houses, etc., because it's movable. But back to you, Bruce. I just wanted to put that in there as we're shifting over to that.
Yeah, that is a good point, though, because the traditional chart is designed to show the diurnal cycle of risings and settings. And with this graduated disk, which Witte developed himself, it's basically two protractors pushed together. But everything is reduced to the ecliptic, and it's placed in the context of the solstices and equinoxes, which you can see up here, form the framework. So it's a whole different setting that the chart occurs in, but it's all on the ecliptic. And I think what he really did was brought into focus this idea that I call resonant ecliptic distance. Now, with Anticia, you have equal distances from the solstices. And with the parts and lots, you have, you complete what are called planetary pictures. You know, suppose if you're born during the day, then your ascendant moon midpoint is going to be the same as the sun part of fortune midpoint. But because the part of fortune isn't a thing, you know, an actual, you know, object or horizon in the case of the ascendant, it's an empty point that's filled that then completes symmetry. But the idea is basically that these distances between points have value when they match other distances, similar distances elsewhere in the chart. So if you have three planets in a row that are, you know, let's just say 70 degrees apart, that's not an aspect. That's close to a quintile. So maybe I should pick a different number. But it's close to, you know, let's call it 68 degrees. That the one in the middle is at the midpoint of the other two. And Witte, you know, called this out and said, this is significant, that this one in the center is actually sucking in and synthesizing the symbolism of the other two. And so that gives that one in the middle a very specific individualized meaning. And this is bypassing the zodiac completely, and it's bypassing houses, although you can use houses in certain ways in the Uranian system. But anyway, that's one of the things, and I think probably the most important thing that Witte did. I mean, he invented the disk, you know, that you see here. He emphasized the use of the harder aspects, the conjunction, square, opposition, semi-square, sesqui-square, and so on. And also one of his students or friends, Ludwig Rudolph, wrote a lot of the things down that he had to say, because Witte didn't write much. Few articles is all I know about. But
it's about 40 articles altogether.
You know, okay, but they're articles.
Yeah.
So Ludwig Rudolph wrote down a lot of these, what these combinations meant. As I said before, one planet at the midpoint of two others. And this became what's called the Book of Rules. And this is of planetary pictures. And this is kind of like a Bible for the system. And it's how you learn. And it's something that grows and develops. I'm sure 100 or 200 years from now, it'll be much thicker than it was when it was first created.
Yeah, it's grown. It's had its jumps and ups and downs over the years. It was actually part of a larger work called the Regal work. And it was designed to be a complete kit for somebody to learn the Hamburg school methods, Witte's methods. Now, Witte wasn't alone. Witte was with a guy named Sigrun for most of the time. And most of the really developmental work in the system, the two of them worked on. It was Sigrun who started what was called the Keplerian Circle in 1915, whose sole purpose was to follow the dictate of Kepler of throwing out the bathwater, that dirty bathwater of astrology, of the old whore of Babylon, but without throwing out the baby, the prize of the whole thing. Keep the essence of astrology. And Witte wanted to make an astrology that was very much like the science of his time, which was a periodic table view of chemistry, or any kind of underlying concepts that create something like a physics. or electromagnetism. As a matter of fact, one of the theories behind the extra planets that Witte put together or proposed along with Segrun was that they followed an electromagnetic theory or electromagnetic spheres. And the great part about that one, just as a side note, right, is that by 1928, they had proposed most of what we call the transnepts, and they define what was proposed by the astronomers in 1951, the Kuiper belt, precisely. And then the Kuiper belt is sighted in 1991. The first objects begin to appear from it. But the Kuiper belt is defined as an orbital elements from 239 years for an object to go around the zodiac to 600 years for an object to go around the zodiac. And Wittean planets are 261 years. And the last one in 1928 was Kronos, was at Admetos at 640 years.
Yeah. You could add Pluto to that too, because Pluto's technically a Kuiper belt object.
Right.
So 1930 would be, when there was the beginnings of some confirmation that this existed.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, Pluto is considered the shepherding factor for the Kuiper belt. Pluto and Neptune are the shepherds to keep the Kuiper belt in some sort of order. But he was following some sort of weird-ass Bode's law, following some electromagnetic theory is the idea. But then he used planetary conjunctions with the sun over the centuries to lock it all in.
Right,
but
that's how the old ephemerides were set up.
What you see in front of you is the dial in motion. We're at the midpoint of sun ascendant, and that's this red line series, and we've minus the moon from the picture. So it's either the part of spirit or the part of fortune. Now, this is the horizon. The sun is below the horizon, so I think it's sun plus ascendant minus the moon. I forget which, though. But either way, the equidistant, this would be then, say, if this were part of fortune, you could see it makes a symmetry with the sun and the ascendant. The midpoint of the part of fortune and the moon stands on the same place as the sun and the ascendant, making this axis. And you'll notice that this axis, even though the part of fortune is unoccupied, stands on what we call the cardinal axis, or on the world chart. One of the things that differentiates Uranian astrology from Orthodox astrology is the ancients used the cardinal axis for antisia and contra-antisia, which they can be labeled on the actual Earth in terms of latitudes of the planets, and the fact that we call them parallels because they pass over the same spot every single day with the rotation of the Earth. So these things were known, but the significance of this cardinal axis itself, which is where we measure the tropical zodiac, is what we in the Uranian system, the symmetrical system, say we all have in common. So there are things here that are in common with everybody. We all share the cardinal axis, and how we're connected to it is how we're connected to the world at large. How we're connected to our ascendant, according to Witte, is how we're connected to our locale, our environment, the people around us. This is an ascendant operation right now. The sun would be the body. The midheaven would be the self, which also differentiates from Orthodox astrology. In other words, the idea of the being manifest, or the ego observing, the being in the act of observation, is the midheaven. And it's also the last point in the horoscope that's activated when a baby is born. The midheaven is the last minute of the soul entering the body. And the midheaven is a function of the equator, not a function of the ecliptic. Now, Witte was, as Bruce points out, hung up on the ecliptic, right? Because he goes from the Greek astrology all the way up to Marinus and then up forward, right? But he had no conception of horizontal astrology that uses the horizon, that predates the Greeks, like Babylonian astrology. He has no concept or use for the Mayan astrology, which Bruce is a scholar in, which has to do with cycles and heliocentric risings and calendrical making, right? These are the things of symmetrical astrology, because it has to grow. The Uranian system's 100 years old. And these extensions have to do with the newer discoveries that are happening. And in keeping with the spirit of what Witte was trying to do, is create the conceptions behind astrology, not the folderol, not the dirty bathwater that Kepler talked about. The conceptions behind astrology. This is our big deal. This is what we have that we have over the ancients. We can conceptualize in very, very different ways. So we have to now look at the Babylonian work, look at the Mayan work, look at the Chinese work, Vedic work, etc., and reconceptualize the principles that underlie what they're doing. Now, the principles that are fundamental in Uranian system is one, a sense of hierarchy. And that's why the personal points, as we call them, manifesting in pars fortuna is so critical. And with Witte, we see it stands right on the Cardinal Axis. Now, it's a funny thing with dead charts, dead people's charts, is that the current transits always seem to be active when we're talking about them. It's like they get really excited that they get called upon again. And we'll note that in Witte's horoscope, if we were to turn the transits on and we go to the midheaven, we see that Pluto is running opposite his Jupiter, his meridian with the Jupiter. And we're talking about him as a dead man. So, it makes a lot of sense. And when you go to that pars fortuna place, right, the sun ascendant, it's due right with Saturn, which means we're all going to be looking at him with a critical eye at this point in time. So things about this chart that should be really evident, right? Let's shut these guys off. Is one, we look at this moon axis and it doesn't quit. You go to this moon axis and it's opposing the Uranus, stands conjunct the Venus and the Mercury. He was an odd character. Apparently, he got married and would eat dinner at his mother's house because he never told his mother he got married. With the concept of the Venus and Uranus, which means birth of a girl, he had 2 daughters, right? But Venus and Uranus also indicates a burning love for astrology. This is Bruce and I both have Venus-Uranus conjunctions in our horoscope, and we've been dedicated to the field since we were young. Bruce says he starts practicing in 1975. I met him at the Rutgers Astrological Society in 1972. and he was a good astrologer back then. And he was integral in starting the Astrological Society of Princeton. So, he's being modest when he says 75, or he wants to hide his age.
Well, I got into it in the 60s, probably around, 67 when I was taking acid and hanging out in Haight-Ashbury. I ran into a lot of people that were into astrology. I think one of what really did it for me was I was out there watching Quicksilver Messenger Service, whose logo was a Q that was the Mercury symbol and the messenger was the Virgo symbol. Uh-huh. And I'm totally stoned on acid in the audience there. And the guy, the rhythm guitar player, comes up and said, "Tonight, there are 5 planets in Virgo." And it just made a big impression on me. And I had known a little bit about astrology before then, but I think that pushed me over the top.
Well, our mentor was Dr. Kenneth Nagus, and he was a great father figure for us in astrology, in essence, because he let us do whatever the hell we wanted,
That's true.
And supported everything we did. And he wouldn't come running into an astrology class and say, "Everybody run outside. Venus and Mars is setting with the moon at the apogee." And we'd all go running out. But,
so Gary, Bruce, we have a question from the audience about, has anyone ever played with or looked at the midpoints of planets, but using the right ascension midpoint instead of zodiacal longitude?
Yeah.
Financial guys, mundane astrologers can use. They use the equator, right? And that sort of stuff. And midpoints work not only horizontally on any plane, like the ecliptic plane or the equatorial plane, but also they work vertically. So in other words, in declination. So in other words, if you're born at 40 north, right, and your natal Jupiter has a declination of 20 degrees, right, real tall declination was in Cancer, something like that. Well, that would mean that your midheaven and the equator midpoint stands with Jupiter. And so you're going to be in a nice Jupiterian place, a happy character, in the planet. So you can do a vertical work. There was an article called The Sinking of the Training Ship Niobe in Hans Nigamann's book, Principles of Uranian Astrology, that talks about zenith charts, these vertical charts. And then if we go to the idea of when we're following financial, or we're looking at earthquakes, or we're trying to do anything that's really, completely of the earth itself, we should see results on the equatorial plane and right ascension.
And Nova Chart Wheels will provide that for you.
Well, yeah, you got to remember that Astrolabe publishes Nova Chart Wheels, but we also publish Solar Fire. And Solar Fire is our encyclopedic program, whereas Chart Wheels is a narrower, focused kind of a thing. But for example, if I wanted to change this to an RA chart, let's get rid of this part of fortune here, right? I could just go and go to coordinate and make it right ascension. And here we are with an RA chart.
Got it.
Or I could go and make it heliocentric or something like that. Witte worked with helio charts as well. And he talked about them as being the father's house, Right. He'd say all the planets are in the father's house. And when we look at it geocentrically, it's Sister Earth's own view of things. So, yes.
I was just going to say another question. The chart, which we're looking at the 90-degree dial, someone is noticing.
No, this is a 360.
I mean 360. We're looking at 360-degree dial at this moment. The porphyry house system is mentioned in the lower left.
Yes.
The person's like, is that wouldn't impact these dials?
No. I mean, the house system that's most preferred among people that practice Uranian astrology is the meridian system.
Yeah.
But this happens to have porphyry on it, which is I use it. I've been using it for almost my entire astrological career.
It's cheap and
it makes
dirty.
sense. It's cheap and dirty, but it's also right on the ecliptic. It just emphasizes the ecliptic, which is what's going on here in using these dials. And I want to mention before, let me get to it now. Gary mentioned Kepler. A lot of Uranian astrology is built on Kepler. Witte, being German, had access to this material that we didn't have access to. And one of the things that Kepler did is he tried to reform astrology and make it more scientific, which Witte was doing again a few hundred years afterwards. But what Kepler did was throw out the Zodiac. He basically reduced astrology to ecliptic positions. And what Witte did was just take that a step further. Kepler related it to ecliptic positions and harmonics, that the aspects became all important, that the angular distances between planets were very important, but he would use a kind of a numerological approach to it. And in the process invented aspects like the quintile and the novile and so on. But Witte expanded it to any degree, as long as it was symmetrical.
Yes.
I think that's a really important point in trying to understand how Witte built this system, that Kepler is one of the primary foundations that it stands on. And Kepler wrote a couple books on astrology, and it appeared in a few of his other works as well. But a lot of that astrology is not known because it's been sanitized.
Two other questions. One is, do we know what he died from?
Yes.
Yeah, Gary will tell you.
Well, when he was running around with his last solar return, he kept telling everybody, this can't be, this can't be. But Witte was a surveyor, well-trained, classically trained, but he was also a homeopath, and apparently made his own cyanide pill. Now, he had attempted to commit suicide a few times in his life when his work was rejected and thrown out the window, and he was fairly depressed. Yeah. But the thing that put it over the edge was there was a thing called Aktion Hess in 1941, where Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland to try to end World War II. And of course, the Brits just arrested him, threw him in jail, and Hitler was really embarrassed. And so they blamed it on his quote unquote Danish astrologer. And they used it as an excuse to round up all the gypsies and psychics and whatnot and folderol. But it was the first time Aryans were arrested for practicing the occult. And Witte was most of the people arrested, they brought them to jail, took their papers, slapped them on the wrist, sent them home with a fine. Witte got all freaked out. And when they came to arrest him at 4 a.m. on August 2nd, he ate the cyanide pill in the police van and died. And he was 61. And it was a loss. You know, it was a terrible loss. So that's how he went.
I think Ludwig Rudolph wound up going to a concentration camp, right?
No, Rudolph didn't go to the concentration camp. Carl Brandler Kraft did. And that guy that wrote Swastika and Zodiac, he worked with Kraft in the camps. No, Rudolph got summoned before the Gestapo in 1937 when they burned the Book of Rules. It was the first Aryan book being burned because it had entries in it about the government, you know, and he claimed that he talked the Gestapo agent out of a copy of the book. And he came home with a copy of the Book of Rules and said, I salvaged one copy. I got one copy. And that was the nucleus for after the war, that one copy of the Book of Rules.
Wow. We have another question, which is, what is the second principle after a sense of hierarchy? So if a sense of hierarchy is the first principle, what would be the second principle of Uranian astrology?
Hierarchy of what?
No, it's the personal points. No, in Uranian system, you have a hierarchy where we have these things called the personal points. And what we say basically nothing happens to you unless the personal points are involved. And the more personal points that are involved, the more intense the action that occurs to you, or the characterization you're putting out, part of the personality. So yes, the first area is the personal points in terms of a hierarchy. The second area is timing itself, which would be the solar arc. So the principle of the progressed sun minus the natal sun as a sensitive arc is basically one of the keys within the system. So it's from the theory of Anticia that planetary pictures are put together, like as for example, his sun and ascendant standing within a degree of the cardinal axis. You can say that the sun is Anticia, the ascendant, right? And it creates a symmetry where the distance from the sun to this pointer is the same as the ascendant to the pointer. And it's the cardinals, right? We could also say Uranus and Neptune are standing on this axis as well, right? So this becomes the second principle, is that it isn't the aspects or the interaction between the planets that are important because we reduce things by hard aspect in the first place. It's the symmetry between planets that are the second principle. And that doesn't mean that things are occupying the midpoint. A lot of people think that something's occupying the midpoint and that's the astrology. No, it's actually the sensitive points, the points that aren't occupied, that become important.
Interesting. All right, we got a minute and a half left.
Okay.
Any gems, brief gems you want to drop on the audience?
I'll say something pretty quick here. Although houses are used in Uranian astrology in a very unique way. There's like houses of the sun, of the moon, of the midheaven, and so on. And they're basically whole sign houses, or equal houses rather, from different points. You can also see on this chart right up here that the house cusps, in this case porphyry, are placed in the 360-degree dial. And you can see interesting things like that Mars and Pluto are conjunct the 8th house cusp, and Saturn on the 6th, and Uranus on the 11th. And that's one of the ways that I've used this Uranian astrology. It's kind of my own adaptation to it. But it does give you it gives you information about houses, but more specifically gives you information about conjunctions between planets in the house cusps themselves, which I regard as being the most important part of the house and not the space, necessarily the space between them.
us becoming a sensitive area. This
Yeah.
business of the houses, what Witte said was that each one of those personal points carries a framework with it, like a house system. So, for example, right over here, I illustrated the ascendant as the first house cusp, which is the way the British people would do astrology in the 70s and the 60s, where they'd use equal houses off the ascendant.
Right.
The square to the ascendant was the nonagesimal. The midheaven was free floating.
Yep.
See, so the midheaven here is in the 10th house of what we would say the ascendant horoscope. He has Jupiter in the 4th house of the ascendant horoscope, and the ascendant horoscope has to do with the location or interaction with others. Whereas if I make the sun the 4th house cusp, right, and make a horoscope around the sun, well, this is about his physical body, the relation to the father, the advantages he had in life in terms of his will. And we see, well, the sun is making a half square to Jupiter, and that Jupiter is in the 2nd house of the sun horoscope. So the father's side of the family probably had some money, right? You can see there was probably some congenital illnesses going on with Neptune on the 6th. Right. And we see that the midheaven or the sense of self is in a sesquiquadrate to the sun. These are hard aspects to see on a pizza.
Gary, I need to cut you off. I'm so sorry. I know we spent all day, but
we can do this stuff all day long.
Where can people find you? And Bruce, where can people find you?
They can't find me.
Okay. You have to be led to the door.
Yeah, I don't answer my phone that much, but
Yeah.
you could probably email me.
Yeah.
Well, being here at Astrolabe is like the clubhouse at
Right.
alabe.alibi.com gets you there. Just Google solar fire, anything like that, and you'll get here. But you can always leave messages, at Astrolabe for me and that sort of stuff. I think at some point we're going to talk about putting together a certificate program for symmetrical astrology through Kepler.
Fantastic.
And I think right now you guys are running about maybe 3 courses. Madeline teaches, and Bruce is teaching. He's been covering symmetrical, right? Those are the 2 courses, 510 or 511.
Yeah.
And then the idea, maybe we can add like maybe 2 or 3 other parts to it and do something where we could say that, you've got a good idea of what this stuff is about, And
you can practice it. Fantastic. Well, thank you both
Thanks for having
being
us.
here today.
You're welcome. Thank
and
you.
participating in our International Astrology Day.